Welcome everyone. Thanks for dropping by and giving me a bit of your time to hear about annotations. So let me kick this off by introducing myself. So I'm Rafael Doms. I have been working with PHP for longer than I like to admit. It's been over a decade. And I'm basically a big fan of community. I love working with user groups, conferences. I've been doing a lot of that. And one of my side projects is also, dealing with code quality and learning new topics. And annotation is one of those topics that captivated me a few years ago, and I decided to, look more into it and research and get more information out there about them. So that's the idea of this webinar. This is an old talk I've been doing a few times in the past few years. Because I feel there is need to spread a little bit more knowledge about annotation. So the idea here is, first I'm going to give you the what, why, and where. So a little bit of history, where annotations came from, not only in PHP but outside as well. Some of the reasons why you should or shouldn't use them, and some examples of people who are already using them. And then at the end, I want to get to a little bit more practical. Which is I'm going to pick one of those engines and show you how to implement your own annotations, which is then going to be very valuable for your project, not only using annotations provided by whatever framework you're using, but also how to roll your own annotations, have your own effects on your solution. Right? Since I cannot see you guys, I'm going to assume that every time I make a joke, everyone's going to laugh, so I hope I get most of that correctly. So let's get an idea of the topic. So what do we mean when we say annotations? Right? Annotations, if we look at the English root of the word, is basically a note that you write regarding an aspect of a text. Right? So you're reading a book, for example, and you jot something down on the side, or you highlight something. Those are annotations, right? You're describing an aspect of that subject, which is the text. You're describing something that goes beyond what the text is telling you. It's your own interpretation or extra information that you have, right? And that pretty much relates to what we know as annotations in language. So in code speak, an annotation is a bit of metadata that's attached to your code, but is accessible at runtime. And it's very important to make this very clear. The effects of annotations are observed at runtime. Right? So annotations is something that's meant for your code to be using while it's running, to be able to look back into the information and make some sort of decision. Right? The annotations itself, they're not effectively code. They're not making changes in your code. They're not affecting that. Pretty much like notes. They're just there to give you more information, which you then can or not use depending on what you want. So they're not effectively part of your working code. They're like extra information attached to it. A little bit brief history. So annotations have been around in other languages. Two examples are Java and C#. In Java, you have annotations that look kind of like this. It shares the same syntax as Java docs, right? Which is the PHP doc equivalent of Java. And they've been around for quite some time. And in C#, they have their own syntax. So this is an example down here. It's pretty much a different syntax. It doesn't share the syntax with their documentation, like happens with Java and with PHP. Right? So in Java, this has been around since version 1.5, and in C#, this has been around since the first release. Right? And these are some of the languages that were looked at while PHP was deciding what annotations should look like, right? So PHP, what happens here? So the main thing with PHP is that we don't have support for annotations. So that's it. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, I'm kidding. Yeah, we don't have support for annotations in core. There is other libraries around it. So let me give you a bit of a history of PHP and how PHP development came along the way in what pertains to annotations, right? So way back when, in early 2000s, PHP doc came around, right? The standard of having a way of documenting your PHP code it came up around this time. PHP was 5, 6 years old by then, when it actually became something that more people were using. This is not PHP Documenter, this is PHP doc, the standard, right? And that was the beginning of where people started looking at, documenting their code and making sure there was extra information attached to the code that was not actually executing code. However, to allow for annotations, we needed one more thing, which ended up showing up in 2005. So in PHP 5.1, the reflection engine finally got support for a method called getDocCommits. So basically, what this method does is, sorry, what the method does is, while the code is running, in runtime, it's able to read the content of that doc block attached to the method, to the class, to the property, whatever it is. So it's able to get the text in runtime for you, which is the essential of annotations, like I described at the beginning. Which means somewhere after that, between 2005 and 2008, the first annotation engines started popping up in PHP. Now, these didn't get much traction. I can't remember the name of the framework now, but it was something with a strawberry. And it was the first one to actually introduce the use of some sort of annotation in this form. But annotations really took off in 2008 with the introduction of Doctrine 2. Doctrine 2 is a port of Hibernate from Java, so it's a ORM. And it relied a lot on the use of annotations as an alternative way of configuring your entities and how they are persisted, right? And this was really good. It was a big improvement over Doctrine 1, and I'll talk a little bit more about that difference. But this was really good, and it got traction. More people were using it, and it became something interesting, which then led to the first IRC. So the IRCs in PHP are the suggestions of new features. This is the way a common developer that contributes to PHP gets a suggestion into PHP with the new workflow we have. So basically, in 2010, an RFC for having annotation support was presented to the core using custom syntax. So more like hash, not using PHP docs like in the Java example, right? Of course, however, this was rejected. Core was very much against the use of annotations and introducing new syntax. The main ideal of Core is having PHP remain simple. So introducing a new syntax is something they didn't want to do, right? So this pretty much killed annotations in Core at that first time. It came around again back in 2011. It sparked up again. We had a bit more people discussing it and coming by, which also didn't lead to any concrete resolutions. The topic kind of comes and goes. So in 2013, again, it came up, but from 2011, it then changed to annotations more in a doc block format. So again, following the Java syntax, not the C hash syntax, right? So currently, if you walk into internals right now and ask about annotations, the reaction you're going to get is pretty much this. Yeah. So it's not a topic that Core likes to address. It's not something that has the same value it has to Core as opposed to general user land. There are very many reasons for and against it. But what we have now is a whole bunch of engines, right? So that's the current state of PHP. This is what annotations look like, provided the Doctrine annotations package. You can see there's a reuse of doc blocks, just like we saw with Java docs and annotations there. And this is actually one of the biggest sources of problems, right? Or disagreement within the community. I want to make a note on the difference of a doc block and a comment, because I hear a lot of annotations are implemented in comments, and doc blocks are not quite comments. So if we look into PHP, PHP is an interpreted language. Whenever we write PHP, the internal parser thing, break it up into OP OP codes, right? Which is what PHP engine actually reads. So when you have a comment, this generates a OP code called tcomment. So this is like a multi-line comment, a single-line comments. That's what the core sees when it reads those. It's a tcomment token. However, when it's a doc block, it actually generates a different kind of token. So there is technically a big difference internally to PHP from a comment to a doc block. They're treated differently. They're not the same thing. Although they look to us like the same thing, the only difference for us is, the extra star asterisk right there. Internally, there's a big difference between them, right? And the other big difference that must be cited is that comments are ignored by the OP code cache, but they are cached by the OP code. The doc comments are cached by the OP code cache. So that means it is available at runtime. It is cached. You're not going to have to be looking at things outside of the OP code cache, which is what increases performance in PHP. Right. So just to be pretty clear on that point, doc blocks, they should be, very important parts of your code and not just simple comments. Right. So if we look at the three examples here, I just want to note on two different types of annotations that you will see mostly in the wild, right? If we look at these examples, and you have PHP, Java, and C#, you can see one type, which is a marker type, which basically has no parameters, has no configuration. It's just kind of like a tag, which is what we use a lot with PHP doc, right? And we also have the parameterized versions, right? Of annotations, where you pass in a few parameters, you configure it a little bit more, right? So this is not really important for right now, but as we go into implementation, this is something you want to keep in mind. Cool. So that is where annotations came from. This is how we got to where we are in PHP. But why should we use annotations? And the big question that everyone asks, and I'll ask of you, is are annotations for you? Should you be using annotations? And the actual answer, I don't know. See, annotations are a very polemic topic. Whenever I speak about this, I get very clear distinction between people that like it and people that don't. Pretty much, this is what the community looks like now. We have the people who hate annotations. We have the people who love annotations. And then we have everyone who has never used them. Pretty much, as soon as you use annotations, you're going to go to either one side or the other. There are many arguments on why and why not. Personally, I like annotations. I like the advantages they bring me. So I want to address a few of the arguments I usually get into, just to give you an idea of my opinion. And again, this may work for your team. This may not work for your team or for your project. So always be mindful that this is one of those things that your team needs to be ready for this kind of, your team needs to value PHP, the doc blocks. Your teams need to be able to understand these concepts. So the first argument I get is, but it's code and it's in comments. Well, no, it's not code. It's essentially metadata. Also, it's not in comments. It's actually in doc blocks. But okay, cool. It's still some kind of code, something that does have an effect into how things are executed, and it's in the doc blocks. So doc blocks should actually be first-class citizens of your code, right? Past are the days where we could just get away with, not worrying about our doc blocks and just doing anything and not caring, right? Code that's written today, it goes around lots of hands. There's lots of people, big teams. Codes are getting shared around in composer projects and packages. So you want to be more careful of your code. You want to, pack more information. You want to be more careful of your doc blocks. You want to make sure that all the information is there. This allows for auto-completion. These allows for, a lot less stressful use of your code. So doc blocks should be something that you are taking care of. So the fact that you have annotations in there, it shouldn't be the case that someone is simply coming in and, removing your doc blocks. That to me is a problem. I believe you should take care of these, and you shouldn't have this kind of situation. The other argument that I get a lot is it's impossible to debug or test them. And that actually goes a bit deeper into what I mentioned about annotations at the beginning. The annotations themselves do not have actual effects on, they don't affect your code directly. They're not code that is being executed. They're metadata that some other code is using. So in order to debug or test your annotations, what you need to do is you test or debug the executor of annotations. Basically, the whatever piece of code it is that looks into your file, finds that annotation in there, and says, "Oh, this annotation is in here, so I need to execute this action." The annotation itself is not really having an effect, right? If you want to test the effects of your code, that's functional testing, and the presence or not of the annotation is not going to make a difference in that case. So it doesn't really make it that harder to test or debug. And the other thing I hear a lot is it does not perform. And I don't see why people would say that, especially because we have caching, right? So sure, if you don't have caching, you might see a little bit of a performance hit. Given the improvements in PHP lately, I don't think that's still an issue. Cool. So why do I love annotations? Why do I think you should use annotations? So the first thing I really like about it is that it's easier to inject behavior into objects without having to extend them. And in this case, to be quite honest, exactly what it is, if you compare Doctrine 1 to Doctrine 2, in Doctrine 1, in order to allow all of the configurations and things to permeate into objects, we had to extend the base classes, right? And in Doctrine 2, you can basically just use configuration, not have that extension. So annotations allow for an easy way to implement that kind of situation and simplify your objects. The other thing that I really like about it is that mostly what I use annotations for is behavior and configuration, right? So validation, persistence, that kind of stuff. And when you use annotations, all that information is contextualized within your entity. It's not in a configuration file somewhere far away. It's right there in the object for you to see and handle. It's easier for you to, detect something that you did wrong if it's right there when you're looking at the file and not in another file far away which you don't remember to check. Right? And the final thing is also it's documentation, right? It's documentation that will now be stored by PHP Documenter if you use PHP Documenter to generate, static documentation from your PHP doc logs. Right? So it's parsed. If you use the latest versions of PHP Documenter, this is a bit outdated on the screenshot, but you can see here that the information is right there about all of the annotations that are attached to, in this case, to this method, right? So that's more information that goes into your static documentation. So people don't even have to be looking at the code. The documentation has all of that in there. So in terms of contextualization, which is what I really find to be good about annotations, let me go through an example of a workflow so you can see how I view this, right? So I'm designing my user class here, and I decide that my user has a name. That's a property I'm going to have in there, and I start thinking about all the things that are related to this, right? It needs to be persisted as a varchar. The length should be 255. It's required, so it can't be blank, and all of the validation and filtering rules, like it should only be letters and all that kind of stuff. That's what's going on in your head as you're creating a property on an entity in your project. Right? So usually what this results in is 3 different configuration files for each of these aspects. You have one configuration file for the persistence, one configuration file for the validation, and one configuration file for the filtering and that kind of stuff, right? You now have 3 files spread out all over your application with, hundreds, if not tens or dozens of properties defined all in that one place, right? That one big long file. Whereas if you use annotations, basically what you do is you wipe all of this and you put the annotations right there within the name. So whenever I look at a user and I see the property name, right there I know it's a string, which is stored in my SQL with a varchar 255. I know the validation rules are in there, and I know which filtering is. Like as soon as I look at that property, I can gather all of this information without having to go look into 3, 4 separate configuration files. That's something I really enjoy because it keeps me focused on what I'm working on. So a few examples of what you can do with annotation out there today. There's a few, there's actually even more than I have here, but there's quite a few examples of people using annotations. Doctrine, PHP Unit, and some frameworks are the basic examples. So let me go over a few of them. If you have used PHP Unit, you have used annotations, right? PHP Unit does use annotations for the data providers, which I'm sure hopefully all of you who are writing tests have gotten in touch with. If you're not writing tests, go talk to Grumpy Programmer, ask him what he thinks about that. But PHP Unit uses it for the data providers and for expected exceptions and a few other examples, right? So this makes it very easy for you to add information and change the behavior of that test. Provider being especially useful. Quick, easy, contextualize. As you're looking at a test, you know exactly what is providing the data to the test, and you know exactly what exceptions you expect coming out of it. Context. That's what I really like about this. Another example is Doctrine, as we said. It uses all this information for persistence. So you can see here persistence examples of how the column should be stored. You know, what if it's an ID, if it isn't, what's the name of the table, what kind of an entity you're dealing with. You can also see things like association down here, one-to-many relationships, all that kind of stuff, right? So that's also pretty useful. You now have an object that describes all of it gives you all that information about how it's going to be persisted right there. Another example is from Symfony, which actually uses it for a few more things, but the main ones are things like routing, pointing to which template the controller should be rendering, so you don't have to put that in your code all the time. It also does validation and a whole bunch of other things like parameter conversion and similar things. So there's quite a bit of these examples within Symfony. Flow-free, and this is where I feel the divide can be crossed, right? Flow-free is a framework, and it uses annotations in a bit more direct way, which is for dependency injection and aspect-oriented programming. So this is not just metadata and configuration. This crosses a little bit more into actually having some interference on how your code runs. This is usually where I draw the line of, okay, this might not be the best way to do this. But again, this is very much an opinion. So you need to see how your team reacts to this and how that works. For me and my team, this is something I try to stay away from. But all the other cases where you have mostly configuration and metadata, those are cases that we very much like to use. It also makes code reviews easier, right? But Flow-free has this example where it's using annotations to be able to inject instances of types into the objects, and also for aspect-oriented, which is something cool. I'm not sure if annotations would be the way I would do it. Okay. So that's where annotations came from. That's how they're being used today. How can we make use of annotations, right? If you have a project, you might have a need of a specific type of configuration. Like whenever an entity has X annotation, I have to pipe it through some kind of service before saving it or after saving it, or that kind of situation, right? And the annotation is kind of the flag you're going to use to do those kind of things. I usually have really good examples of annotations. I'm completely drawing a blank now. But as we walk through, you might get a few ideas, and I'll try to share a few also at the end. So basically, if you need annotations in your project, you decide to put them in, what you're going to need is an annotation engine, right? So what does an annotation actually do? An annotation engine actually do? So when you have your code and you put in annotations, basically what you're going to have is you're going to add annotated doc blocks into your code, right? So you have here a tag that receives parameters. That's in your code, fine, but we need to extract that. So the first step is using reflection, we can read that method. We can read that doc block of that method, right? Which basically gives us the whole doc block. It's basically a dump of the string. It doesn't even remove the divide, the limiters around it. It just gives you that whole thing. That's what PHP does. Here's the block. Figure it out. So what the engine must do is parse this, figure out the annotations that it can support, and ultimately give us an instance of the annotation configured with the parameters that were passed in. So every annotation maps out to an object that represents that annotation, which can then receive configuration. And that's pretty much what all of the annotation engines out there do. Convert the string into instantiating an actual object and handling those parameters for you. Right? So a few examples of annotation engines out there that you might want to choose from. We have Doctrine, which has annotations now segmented as well from PHP Documenter actually has a standalone package that does parsing of doc blocks, not focused on the annotation level of functionality, but more focused on the annotation level of a doc block. Right? There's a library called PHP Annotations, which has actually been around for quite a while and has gotten more attention lately from the developers. I actually met the core developer once in Canada while I was giving this talk. And there's Notage, which is written by a friend of mine from Paraguay, which is a smaller package, more focused, but also a different interpretation. So comparing these packages, they're pretty much all, except for Notage, in a stable release. Doctrine Annotations is actually a fork from Doctrine 2.3 because it was in the Commons library. So essentially, it was split out and its numbers dropped back down to 1. But it's a stable release. It has been in use for, I want to say, maybe almost 4, 5, 6 years, since 2008 roughly, right? It just has been split from Doctrine very recently. PHP Documenter, the new version 2.0 is out, and this library is following that up. PHP Annotations has been around for a while as well and is still receiving new releases. Notage is on its 16th beta or alpha release. It's still not considered stable by the developer. The good news is all of these are available on Composer, which is a great first step. If you want to find any of them, these are the names that you can use. And that's really good. That's really an improvement for all of us. That Composer is giving us that capability of having everything around and easy to use. All of them are standalone packages. They don't require, they're not tied into a bigger framework. You can, they just pull in whatever they need. So they're all pretty small and easy to use. The only difference here is that the PHP Documenter does not support full annotation implementations. It supports the marker type, and it will interpret anything that we consider parameters as part of that marker, whereas the other libraries are focused on really implementing annotations, so you will get support for all the parameterized stuff that we mentioned. So the difference also is that Doctrine annotations have been used everywhere, right? So Symfonies and Framework, Flow, all the examples I showed here, most of them are using, all of them are using annotations, and a lot more people out there are using Doctrine annotations, right? So for that reason, when I was researching into this and writing my own library with annotation support, that is the engine I decided to use to make these things happen. It's also people are more familiar with the syntax since it's already in most of the frameworks people are using. So what I want to do is I want to explain to you how that engine works, what internally happens with the Doctrine annotation engine, right? So pretty much you have to declare the annotations you're going to use. You have to import the namespace. So this doesn't have the same value, it doesn't have the same meaning as in Java when you import stuff, but you need to import these libraries so that the engine knows how to find the annotations from string into instances. Once you do that, the annotation reader, which is part of the Doctrine library, will read those doc blocks and convert them to the metadata that I mentioned, right? So it's an instance of these objects that represent the annotations with their configuration in there, right? From there, it does two things. It gives you that for your code, your walker, whatever is going to use those annotations to iterate over all those objects and do what they want with them. And it's also going to cache them, so the next time that you ask about this class, it will not have to read those things and reparse them. It'll just give you the cache of what you already had before, right? So to give you an idea of something more, a little bit concrete, I want to do something with input filtering, right? Input filtering is a very important part of our day-to-day lives as developers. We should be aware of security issues. And I wanted to do input filtering on my entities using annotations. You know, like I use validation in Symfony, I wanted to use the same thing for filtering. So I'm going to use this library, which was developed as a research project for this, to kind of get you through. It's a DMS filter library. You can check it out on GitHub. It's on DMS or DMS-filter, which gives you the specific library. So the ingredients that we need here first we have rules. So these are the annotations. These are the things we're going to add to our objects. So filter alpha, filter alphanumeric, that kind of stuff. Then we have the executioners. So these are the things that actually cause the effect of the annotation. They will get a rule, they will get the object, and okay, now I need to actively filter it, remove all the alpha, make it alphanumeric compatible. Then we have a service, which is basically our middleman. It's the guy who gets an object and triggers all of these actions and knows how to find the executioners and all that kind of stuff. And then we have an annotation engine, which is pretty much what Doctrine will be doing. And we need, obviously, objects with annotation, so annotated objects. We need that as part of the whole thing. Otherwise, you don't have anything to read. So the process kind of looks like this, and start here on the top left corner. We have an annotated object, which has the strip tags rule attached to it, right? So basically, all the values in this particular property should have all of the tags stripped, allowing only the tags that I have defined in there, so bold and italic, right? In green, you have there some text, a sample text that would be the value of that property. So that goes into the filtering service, which then re-extracts those rules and instantiates the actual rule classes, the actual annotations, right? So that's the rules strip tags with the proper configuration. It's then passed on to the actual filter object that is able to read that and execute the action, so actually removing all those tags from there, which finally returns that filtered object, the value, which can then be overwritten in the object. Right? So basically, the filter service and the annotation engines are the guys doing all of those things, and we have the rules and the enforcers hanging around. Right, so this is what a rule would look like, and this is the strip tags rule. Basically, what we need to do is you need to import the namespace, as we said, and attach the annotation. It also does handling of the rules. So basically, the first thing you need to do is tell Doctrine that this is an annotation. So whenever it finds strip tags in a doc block, it should go and say, oh, okay, there's a strip tags annotation here. This object represents it. I can instantiate it now, right? So ironically, that is done with an annotation. Go figure. But this is the kind of things that I mentioned, right? It's all contextualized. And then basically what it needs to do is handle how it gets options, right? So the default option, different configuration parameters. Basically, you have a constructor that will receive an array of options. That's what Doctrine will do internally. You will get all of those parameters, convert that into an array, and hand it over to you in the constructor. So that's pretty much what you need to do, is handle those things and put them in the right places. So an example of how these configurations are passed in, we have here an annotation, and we have things going in, right? One is a parameter without a name called name, and then we have a named parameter called nullable with a value of true. So what happens here, you have one parameter which you're not defining, and the other parameter is named. Internally, this is what the first one is what we call the default property. So your object will tell Doctrine, okay, the default property, if they don't say what they're passing in, is, for example, my title configuration, right? So whenever it does, whenever Doctrine instantiates that object, it will put all of that in an array and pass that as a key value pair. For the key of that default property, it will ask the object, okay, what is the name of your default property, and get that key into it, right? So basically, it can also it does either constructor injection, or it can do injection through setters, which basically it'll say, okay, set the value of this property, and it will ask you for the property name, which is the get default property method. So in order to be compliant with how these things are built, there's a few interfaces of Doctrine that you need to implement. The enforcer, then, being the person who actually executes that, it is pretty much simple. It's a strip tags filter. It just needs to call the strip tag. It's just, you know, boilerplate stuff around the actual PHP method. So this is where actually the action goes. So this is no longer an annotation. This is a class that is called by an annotation. And I'm sorry, there's actually a typo there. I left an annotation in there. It doesn't need to be here. The annotation should not be there. That's a typo. So this is what actually does the filtering, and it basically receives that configured annotation with all the information it needs, and it uses that configuration to do the filtering. That's pretty much it. Right? So this doesn't really know anything about annotations themselves. It just knows that it gets an object which has rules, and it's supposed to do stripping. Right? So this is a completely different object. And then finally, we have the filter service. So the filter service, just to give you an idea of what you would need in a service that implements filtering, this is the life cycle of it, right? It gets instantiated, you have a new service, and receives a reader from Doctrine. Okay, this is someone who can understand annotations and give me the instances. So when someone calls a function in it, in case filter with an object, it will go through all of those properties, get each of the annotations, right? So a strip tags filter, an alpha filter, alphanumeric filter, whatever. It will get you an array of all those things. Once it has all of those rules in place, it will then find the people who are responsible to enforcing those rules, the actual filters themselves. It will filter those values, get those values passed through whoever is responsible, and then it will finally update the original object with the new values. Once that's done, it sends the object back and gets ready for doing it all again. Right? I'm sorry for filter. It's an overused word in the English language. Filter is both a noun and a verb, and so it gets very confusing. So I hope you can actually keep track of what's going on here. But basically, that's what's going on. The filter gets an object, triggers the acquisition of those properties, and triggers all of the actions related to that. I want to get into a little bit more detail into the annotations, how you get annotations for a property. If you are going to implement, this is something you need to be aware of. So basically what we have here is going over all of the properties in our object. We would call the reader and say, get me the annotations for this property. Right? This is what we're getting here. What's going to happen here is it's going to get all the annotations. So if you have validation, persistence, filtering, all of those things in that doc block, it will get you all of those instances, regardless of what they are. It will get you, as long as it can map those into actual objects that it knows about, it will give you all of those. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that you only have your annotations, which is why it's good for your annotations to extend a common object. So you can just say, okay, if this annotation is not an instance of rule, then I don't need to worry about it. If it is, then basically what I do is I add everything to this metadata object, which is a glorified array with all of the things that need to be done, right? So this filter service is some of the boilerplate that you need to implement. It's basically something that that knows how to navigate through your objects, get the annotations out, and then pass them into your business logic. I'm a big nut about object calisthenics and making things simple. So if you notice by now, The filter service has way too much responsibilities, and those are not all implemented inside it. These actually divided into handling metadata, into or interacting over the object. Inside the metadata handling, you can it's also separated between caching and loading. So no, I'm not violating my own rules. I just want to give you this feedback. If you go and look into the code in the repository, you're going to see all of these pieces that basically play a common role in all that, right? So the final example of this, using annotation straight down, you're basically going to get a reader. You're going to enable it for parsing PHP stuff. Then you're going to get an annotation loader, which is your own implementation that knows how to find the things you want. You need a metadata factory, and then basically you just want to put all of this in your dependency injection container. There is some classes out there which help, putting all of this into a simple interactive, easier to interact with object. Unfortunately, it's not in the annotation library. You need to do some of this beforehand. And then once you have an entity, you call the filter, and you get filtered objects, right? So you get filtered results at the end. That's pretty much it, right? So the top 3 lines, the top 3 blocks are all building the things that the annotation engine needs, and the bottom 3 are you actually using that service. Once you get into the dependency injection container, then you don't need to worry about it. There's plenty of bundles for all that stuff out there. Okay, so that's what I wanted to share with you guys about where annotations came from, what they're useful for, why I like using them, and how you can start looking into implementing your own, supporting your own type of annotations in your project. I would really love to thank the PHP Storm guys for inviting me. And if you are using PHP Storm, if you're not, you should be. You want to look at the PHP Annotations plugin by Daniel. This is really awesome plugin. It will help you with autocomplete inside the doc blocks. It will also help you with making sure that all the use entries on top of the file are there present, so you can use all those annotations. So if you are using annotations and you are coding in PHP Storm, that plugin is something you definitely must check out. And if Daniel is listening, thank you so much for that plugin. It really helps a lot. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for coming and open the floor for questions.
Yeah, and we've got a few questions already. So the first one is, do you have any idea if or when annotations will be ever in a standard in PHP?
That is a tough question. Annotation in core is not something I believe will happen in the next major releases. I don't think that's going to come in. There's a lot of focus elsewhere in the core. Also, the libraries that we have currently are dealing very well with supporting that, except for the fact that it's not in core. So I don't think it will be in core, I don't know, for the next 1-2 years at the very least. I think that the discussion will come again, but with the current focus, they're not going to focus too much on that. But in terms of userland space, I pretty much see the document annotations as the standard pretty much. Mostly everyone who's using annotations is using it, but you also have options, right? There's a bit of boilerplate you need to implement, like I showed with the DMS libraries. Maybe some of the other libraries I showed might have a smaller footprint. But as far as being familiar, I would say mostly the developers who use Symfony are mostly all familiar with the doctrine syntax.
Thank you. And the next question is, how easy is it to use Doctrine ORM annotations for your own use? For example, in order to understand property types in entities.
Okay, so it's not that hard. Basically, what I did here with the last part of the webinar, that's pretty much showing you what implementing your own annotations against Doctrine is. You basically have a few boilerplate things in terms of how you handle metadata and how you iterate over objects. That could be simplified. But handling the property types inside of the annotation is pretty easy. Basically, Doctrine handles that, right? It'll convert, strings. It supports true, false, and constants like that. Integers. It also supports objects. I can't exactly remember if it converts the object into an entity or if it gives you the actual name of the class that you can then easily instantiate. There are some limitations, obviously. It's in a doc block. Doc blocks, it's text. They don't really have code, so you can't pass in, this property or that property. But there are many other ways that you can do that, depending on how you implement your service that read that. If anyone wants to see more of that, please ping me up on RSC or on Twitter. And look at the repository for DMS filter and the DMS filter bundle, where I do a few things to be able to allow, for example, you to use an annotation in Symfony that actually refers to a service and a method inside a service of the dependency injection container, right? So basically what the annotation has is a bunch of string values, but then whoever reads the annotation can then take those string values and manipulate them into object entities, services in the dependency injection container. Essentially, there's no limit to what you can do with that information. You can basically do everything you want. The information that comes from the annotation is pretty much standard, basic, what do you call it, primitive types in PHP. They're all supported in there.
Thank you. And the next question is a use statement actually required? Can I not use a full class with namespace?
So the use state, we kind of define it as required. You can use the full namespace. I'm 90% sure of that. Given the size of the namespaces we have currently, you probably don't want to do that. It generates too much noise. So having the use kind of simplifies that so it looks readable, right? It's easy to convey information. So it's better to have ORM as opposed to doctrine, ORM, mapping, annotations, and column, right? That doesn't feel so good in your code. So the use of the use is something I recommend just because of the simplicity and the readability of things. But as far as I remember, it's not required. It's just a way to simplify that namespace.
Thank you. And the next question is about performance. How much of an impact annotations do on the whole project performance in general?
So depending on the framework you're using, you're already paying that price. If you're using Symfony, for example, the price is already in there. It's already doing the checking, right? The main performance that you're going to get there is, one, the reflection, which some things in reflection can be slow, and the parsing of the string and instantiating of objects, right? Those two costs, they're definitely not going to be a bottleneck, and they're not that significant, right? I haven't noticed in any of my projects a leap that I can say, okay, annotations are to blame for this, we need to drop them. With caching, that cost basically goes down to a one-time thing, and from there on, basically you just have the memory of keeping objects in the memory space, which with the latest versions of PHP is, that cost is going down and down a lot more. So having those objects there is not really that much of an issue. Again, it depends on your scale, obviously.
Thank you. And there's the next question. Is there more use cases except validation, filtering, where annotations can save time or reduce code amount?
Actually, I'm struggling with my memory now to remember. I had a discussion with someone about other use cases, and there's definitely a lot more out there. Basically, anything that you can consider configuration, you can turn into an annotation. Not anything, but there's lots of use cases for those types of things. For example, Symfony also has the parameter converter where you can tell the controller, hey, for this this property you're getting, this is actually an object of this type, and it'll go behind the scenes into the database, load that object based on the ID and that kind of stuff. And there are actually a lot of things you can use in your application. Depends on your business logic. You might be able to extract a few things. For example, you can convert your business logic into annotations. So, for example, this entity requires, let's say, for example, you have an object shooting off the top of my head, right? You get what do you call it? In Dutch, we call it a KVK number. So it's basically your government issue ID. And whenever you have an annotation on that property, you can say, okay, populate this with more information, for example. That's a pretty bad example. I'm drawing a blank now. But you can automate things, right? You can basically, the idea of annotating objects is you're adding that extra information, and people can come in, another service can come in, pick out those few properties, and execute operations on them. So anything that can be pushed into that kind of scenario is a good use case. And I'm really sorry I can't remember any off the top of my head, other than the ones that are on the slides. But yeah, do ping me on RSC or Twitter later on. I might be able to shake a few things up in my head again.
Thank you. And we have a few suggestions on different usage from our attendees. For example, Alexander is telling us about Selenium locators like find by, for example. Yeah, and I think we will go for the next question. Are there multiple annotations supported like in Java 8?
What do you mean by that? I didn't quite catch it.
So that, for example, you have for one member and you annotated something like some annotation value 1, some annotation value 2. Yeah, and this some annotation is the same kind of annotation.
Okay,
it's multiple instances of same annotation
yeah.
for one member.
I don't see why not. I've seen different. If they conflict, then whoever consumes the annotations, that might get a little bit confusing. But as far as I know, the engine can handle that and give you an array with more than one instance of that variable with the different configuration values. So it's basically going to map all of those annotations into an array. How you handle that, it's up to you. It's just going to give you those annotations. So I'm pretty sure that works. I haven't tried it myself, but I don't see any reason why it shouldn't.
Thank you. And it seems we are running out of time, so I think we will move on to some final slides. And if anyone has some questions, you can definitely tweet to Rafael at AirDoms in Twitter, or also comment any of our blog posts, and we will definitely forward all the questions. So I would like to thank Rafael for a great presentation today. Thanks for coming.
Thank you for the invitation. I love working with you guys over the PHP Storm. It has made my life so much easier. I think I can actually do a whole presentation on just how it makes my life easier. I should maybe try and get on that.
Yeah, I think that we can definitely try it in a couple of months. Yeah, thanks a lot. And I'll be transferring a screen back to me just for a few minutes to show some links. So here we go, just a few links. Home for JetBrains PHP Storm. It's at jetbrains.com/phpstorm, and you can find a PHP Annotations plugin in the repository, right in the product, in settings plugins. And all the feedback you can send to Rafael or with Twitter, or just send it to us. And the video is going to be available in a few days on our YouTube channel. And we will definitely announce it in the blog and social media. And one more thing, make sure to follow us in Twitter and other media resources so that you get notifications about future webinars. Thanks everyone for attending. Thanks Rafael for a great presentation, and develop with pleasure.